Alex, I think you had some questions to get started, some turbo questions you want to test, right?
Yeah, I know, Cassie, it's a bit early on your side of the world, right? It's like, is it 10:30 or 8:30?
It's kind of complicated for me actually. I live in Central Time, but the teams that I work with are all Pacific. So I work in Pacific Time, but it's 12:30 here.
Ah, okay, we're awake. Great. We had this thing to get you started where we're gonna play a little association game where we're gonna ask 5 questions, more like we're gonna say 5 different words, and you would just share the first thing that comes to mind. How does that sound?
Sounds like an interesting psychological profile. All right.
Okay, I'll start. Food,
Curry.
Blockchain,
Outdated.
product,
Market fit.
city,
Project Red.
and programming language.
Scala.
Okay, these were really quick. Good. You're up and running. Thanks for doing these. We noticed it's sometimes easier for people to just like kickstart the chat by sharing their associations. But I never thought about it as a psychological profile, but you're absolutely right. It kind of gives you an insight of how the person thinks and, what's on top of their mind.
Yeah, I really like the blockchain outdated.
Yeah, I know. I thought there was going to be like a particular blockchain, but this was a completely different direction, which is absolutely in line with everything you're working with, obviously.
Yeah, and I was watching Casey I think it's a little bit old, a few weeks old, the YouTube video about Quilibrium, and I found it very, very interesting. I know it can be very technical, right? And maybe to give you a little bit of our background, I'm a computer scientist, so I will say I'm a technical too, but I have to admit you went into very deep, hardcore, design decisions. So we will try to ask you questions about the product you're building, the network you're building, how it works from a user perspective, and yeah, also I'm very curious about your background at Coinbase and working at Farcaster. So maybe we can start with what are you doing right now, Casey? How do you define what you're working on for those that don't know you?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting winding history, I guess. So I've been in the crypto space. I guess you could call me an OG. I was a subscriber to the Metstad mailing list. I was on a lot of mailing lists when I was younger. I was very interested in cryptography and security in general, and so Metstad was just one of the many that I was on. And what I always loved about the Metstad community was that the nature of skepticism around cryptography is quite high. So, which is that kind of ruthless rigor is really important when you're designing crypto systems. So, it's naturally a high skepticism bar that you have to pass if you're trying to suggest anything new. And there'd been previous conversations around the ideas of digital cash and whatnot. And eventually, that fateful day in October of 2008, the Bitcoin white paper landed, and it led to a very interesting discussion. And, remarkably, there was still a high degree of skepticism. A lot of people, even in the early days, were calling out things like, whether or not this would lead to overexertion of energy expenditures due to proof of work, which was on the like deeply understanding but critical side. And then there were, of course, the minarchist or libertarian mindsets that were just like, yeah, this is really cool. So that was really amazing to see the discussion unfold, and I was super stoked. And so the first opportunity I could start mining on my computer, I did. So that was how I first got introduced to crypto. Outside of that, I was actually working basically in fintech. And so, like classical Web 2 fintech. And so I was accustomed to seeing the world through the lens of how companies interact with other companies on a financial level and, the kind of restrictions that they have about how they have these interactions. especially the higher up you go in terms of Fortune, like Fortune 500, Fortune 10s, they tend to be really, really, how do I say this, really restrictive about the ways in which they can interact with each other. So no cloud services, no things like that. So anyway, while I was in that domain, I was specifically working on a project that did virtualization appliances. Basically think like AWS cloud, but in a box. And it was basically to provide any sort of SaaS related services that a Fortune 10 style company needed, but they couldn't use it inside of like a typical SaaS offering. They had to have it inside their data center. So I became really familiar with the high security requirements, the export of data that is restricted and how that's managed. And right around 2017, 2018, me and the co-founder of or not co-founder, the CTO of a company I was working at doing this project decided to split ways and just go deep into crypto. And so there was a approach that we were trying to do, because these accounting departments between these companies, they saw the merits of distributed ledger technology, but their big frustration was that distributed ledgers are open. The data is public, and just like the Fortune 10 SaaS issue, you can't have that data be public. You can't expose your your vendors, your suppliers, your ongoing bills. That's all proprietary information, and it's like sometimes very like business critical that those things remain trade secret. And so it was a realization to us that certain technologies around distributed ledgers, such as zero knowledge proofs, are very valuable. And so we started off on this idea of doing a zero knowledge proof ledger that would basically reconcile accounts receivable and accounts payable books between different companies. And it all happens on a distributed public ledger, but the data is private. And so that was the original formation of where I was starting to actually like do a true crypto play as a company.
Sorry to interrupt. When was this again? Which year? You said 2018?
Yeah, it was about 2018.
Okay. Oh, that's quite interesting. I used to work, and I think it's very much related to what you are talking about. I am very curious to see how it ended, but I was working in a software company optimizing processes for accounts payable, trying to improve like internal processes from companies, trying to find inefficiencies. And we use some AI and a technology called process mining. But yeah, it was not crypto related. Just wanted to mention that. But go ahead. How did that end, that initiative?
Yeah, so like I said, I'd been in the fintech space for quite some time, so I was familiar with the belly of the beast, so to speak, and how a lot of these deals get done. And the investors that were, in on the seed round and eventually in on the A round of the company, they were also very familiar and comfortable with how those types of deals are navigated. And ultimately, we were pushed away from the crypto angle, and it became much more of a traditional Web2 style company. That was a real bummer for me, because like this was my first professional opportunity to be deeply involved in the crypto space, and moving away from it was a big disappointment to me. So I parted ways from them and joined Coinbase. And that was about 2021 was I think when I joined. And while I was at Coinbase, I was a senior staff engineer, built out the mobile MPC tooling. Before Wallet as a Service came out, there was a feature in the Coinbase retail app, still there, that Web3 wallet feature. The MPC technology that does, the distributed signing between your mobile phone and Coinbase infrastructure. My big responsibility and I guess story at Coinbase was that I put it on a mobile phone and made that functioning viable for the retail app. Obviously, it was a much larger team endeavor, but the big thing was that getting it to work on mobile phones was kind of a pain, and I figured out the trick to make that work.
How did you see the effect of it going to the mobile?
So there's some details that I can't discuss still, because I'm still bound under NDA about that. But it was definitely a sea change for the way that people interact with crypto wallets. There were other MPC wallet manufacturers that existed at the time. I think the biggest was probably Zengo, and I think they're still around. But the big thing about, the entire vertical integration of Coinbase retail, people being able to buy and sell crypto very quickly and then immediately send it to their Web3 wallet that was baked into the same application. That was a very powerful thing because from the perspective of an end user, it then becomes very simple. Like I buy crypto, I use it immediately. I don't have to think about managing between an exchange and a wallet. It's all very seamless and intuitive. And the other big benefit to it was that, MPC creates these key shares such that your mobile phone has one, Coinbase infrastructure has the other. So there's no one key that lives anywhere. It's just key shards. And so managing that from a user's perspective now becomes seamless. It's no different than like when you're dealing with passkeys or something. It's just it's a technology that lets them do the same things they were going to do with a wallet, but they don't have to worry about key management.
And is that something similar to what Coinbase Wallet, or is it the same thing, has released just recently, which I think is also the ability to basically log in without the complexity of the setup?
Yeah, so there's now Coinbase Wallet as a service, and that project was ongoing. They hadn't released the SDK yet by the time I left. And it's a very similar premise. And in fact, like most of the team involved is largely shared. So I was on the core cryptography organization at Coinbase, and most of the core cryptography team ended up also contributing to the wallet as a service project.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. It's a shame that we cannot hear the full story, but I understand you are under NDA. But I wonder, Casey, from Coinbase, then you were already working on Quilibrium, is that right? And maybe can you introduce us to Quilibrium? How do you define it, and when did you start working on it?
Yeah, so Equilibrium in its earliest inception was an idea that I was basically ruminating on after the departure of, or the pivot, for lack of a better word, at that startup that I had co-founded. I really thought that the core idea of a distributed ledger that had private data and being able to reconcile that data between entities was a direction that was a very powerful like concept even at its core, and it could do more than just reconcile books between accounting departments. And so it was basically an idea I had been kicking around in my head for quite a while. And as I was leaving that company and joining Coinbase, I was running this educational series on Twitch where I was teaching people how to develop applications at like a FANG caliber, like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, etc. And while I was doing that, I was teaching through example, and one of those examples was building a alternative to Discord. Basically, here's how Discord scales out to millions of users. Here's how you do it. Here's the technologies and techniques you would have to apply. And while I was running that series, I obviously was building out enough features of it that it was, something viable enough that I could actually launch. But me personally, I'm a big proponent of freedom of speech, and I recognized that Discord itself was running into some serious issues. They had basically kicked out, I don't know if anybody here remembers this, but the Wall Street Bets community from Reddit had created a Discord, and they got kicked off of Discord just because their particular in-group language that they used was a bit rough around the edges to other people who were unfamiliar, and to them, to Discord, it seemed like a PR nightmare. So they banned the community, and to me, that was unacceptable. Like this idea that a community can't be self-regulating on their own language, and you had to step in just because it looked bad for you for PR is it's an overreach, especially for a communication tool. And so I realized that that pressure wasn't just from Discord. That pressure was actually coming up from the App Store level. And so that series of bunny trails that I went on with that essentially resulted in me reaching the conclusion that the only way to actually solve this problem and have something meaningfully distinct from Discord, rather than just, if you're going to make an alternative to Discord that's just Discord, then nobody's going to use it. They're just going to use Discord, was to make it fully peer-to-peer and decentralized. And so that brought me back into the space of what I was trying to do with this original idea that was this distributed ledger concept. And so through that period of running this stream, I ruminated over a number of ideas and architectural decisions that ultimately stepped away from ideas like blockchain and moved towards verifiable delay functions for the consensus mechanism, and inevitably ended up being the early idea of what Quilibrium is today. And so while I was at Coinbase, how this all tied together was the team there that we ended up acquiring. It was a company called Unbound that was run by Yehuda Lindell. They had a lot of techniques around MPC because that was Yehuda Lindell's specialty as a very amazing cryptographer. And what it revealed to me was that MPC can actually be really, really fast. I was accustomed to a lot of these more advanced cryptographic techniques being slow. They were practically non-functional unless you deeply specialized the approach for a given, protocol. Like if I wanted to do threshold wallet signing, that I would have to use a very specialized protocol. But as it turned out, the actual raw circuit, the underlying logical primitive that implements a particular algorithm, can actually be turned into a garbled circuit for MPC efficiently enough that it's actually got a reasonable runtime. And so that was the final inflection point for me about what could be done to make Quilibrium be as powerful as possible and be as strong as possible in providing privacy guarantees. And so through that entire culmination of events, we end up here today with the current state of what Quilibrium is.
Yeah, that sounds like an exciting journey. And maybe just for those that aren't familiar with, that's multi-party computation. Is that right? That's
Yeah, that's
what it
correct.
means. Okay, and so you are right now working on Quilibrium, but you also work at Farcaster. Is that right? What is your role at Farcaster? I guess engineering, but are you working on something in particular, or how do you describe what you're doing there?
Yeah, so at Farcaster, can you
Yes. All right. Yeah.
That was so interesting.
Yeah, I heard a bit about that in the video, in the YouTube video.
Which part?
Yeah, the we should ask her about. I mean, I want to talk more about Equilibrium, but she in the 1 hour and a half video, she mentioned how she didn't like Base, the blockchain, the new blockchain.
Yeah, I actually heard it from a few people because it's extremely centralized.
Yeah, we can include that.
Can you
Can
hear
you
us okay?
can you hear us, Casey?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I heard something about extremely centralized.
Oh yeah, we were just because me and Kaloh were talking while you left about the fact that sort of like comparing Quilibrium, like we wanted to dive a bit more into it because from what I heard, it's very centralized, and so I'm assuming, like you mentioned earlier, that's the reason you wanted to shift away. But is there any other chain that you think kind of like carries the ethos of what Quilibrium is that you think are doing a good job?
Uh, I think there's a few, but I do want to, I guess, pry a bit into that statement. You're saying Quilibrium is centralized, or that there's other things that are centralized?
Base.
No.
Oh, Bayes. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a bit of a fun subject for me.
Okay.
Yeah, so to kind of, I guess, go back to the question that you had asked right before I had to drop for a sec, my Mac was telling me that I was running out of memory. I guess I had a runaway process that was just churning through RAM. Anyway, so at Farcaster, I do a number of different things. I've contributed to the underlying hubs protocol, but the biggest thing and the biggest reason that I had joined in the first place was to support direct casts. So the end-to-end encryption, when we were still supporting that before we added web browser support for direct casts, cast itself, a bunch of different features around that, that's been my handiwork. So to answer the question about Base, I actually have a few different points of view. From a from a founder to founder level, I have an immense amount of respect for the business development work that Base does, like that Jesse's been doing with Base. Phenomenal job, like getting these partnerships, amazing. And I cannot speak highly enough of the degree of support that he's lent to developers and getting them onboarded and supporting them along the way. That is great. My problem with Base is purely from an ethos standpoint about what crypto is. And so to me, crypto is about decentralization. That's been the whole point from day one. The original Bitcoin white paper was essentially a resounding call to action that centralized systems are corrupt, inherently corrupt, or are prone to corruption, or at least influence. And so, the original Genesis block of Bitcoin was essentially kind of a snide remark about how our financial system is incredibly broken with no transparency, and essentially like these individuals with high degree of power that are capable of issuing bailouts to banks or issuing tight monetary controls that either inflate the currency or do other weird manipulations, like what happens with China with respect to global trade. And so these types of things are, the inherent harms that are being called out in the crypto scene. And so to me, even if it's an L2 that's posting commitments to an L1 that might be decentralized itself for the L1's sake, being a centralized actor that is sequencing any kind of data to be put onto an L1, but is a centralized actor, no matter how good the intentions of the company managing that centralized sequencer is, they are still beholden to US law in the case of Coinbase, or the laws of whatever host nation in the case of other L2s that are centralized. And so by consequence, they are required to censor transactions that do not comply with US law. And therefore it is it's not decentralized, it's not censorship resistant, and that might have benefits for certain conditions, but that is not crypto. That is just something that interacts with crypto with a very crypto looking interface, but it's not crypto.
No, that's a great point. And is it possible it has the potential to be decentralized? Like technically, will it be decentralized in the future, or is that just not possible?
Oh, it's totally possible. So that comes back around to one of the other moral objections that I've had about Base specifically is just that Base being an optimism fork, optimism itself is still in this very centralized state. They've tried to come up with two different marketing angles on how it, if you squint at it, you can make it kind of not centralized. And the way they've done that has been either through trying to call out this idea of a super chain, that all of these optimism forks work together, and so collectively it's a set of different L2s, and you can think of it all as this quote super chain, and somehow that makes it decentralized, which is not true. That's at best that's a federated model, and federation does not mean decentralized. It just means that you're getting decentralized adjacent, but it's not the same thing. And then the other angle that they go on is that fraud proofs or fault proofs, whichever they want to call it, is their means to decentralizing the sequencer. And they've recently published an approach to doing that, but it's still not integrated and it's still not part of the running mainnet. So at this point, it's still not in place and not decentralized. And there's still a couple of other different aspects to how an L2 can be fully decentralized. I believe there's really, like, if you look at L2 Beat, there's really only one network that actually successfully could call themselves decentralized as an L2.
Which one?
Hang on a sec. I'm actually going to pull it up because I don't want to misspeak. At the same time, my browser is giving me grief.
No worries. We're just going to save the link because we're going to write up afterwards. So it's good to have some references.
Yeah, the closest would be Arbitrum.
Okay.
Ah,
arbitrary.
nice.
Nice.
I wanted to ask a few questions, like also for people that are going to be reading and listening. It's about how do you, how do you manage your time? Is there a team? Like, I guess from an entrepreneurial side, since we are talking about, basement builders and things like that.
How do I manage my time in general?
Your time and building Quilibrium, balancing it together with working at Farcaster. Do you have a team, or are you doing it? Are you working on it by yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, so Quilibrium's been a solo endeavor for quite some time. I think one of the things that stands out to a lot of people is just the sheer volume of how much stuff has been shipped around Q, and that makes people feel like that it's almost superhuman or impossible. And I mean, like, I'm not going to like toot my own horn here, so to speak, and say that it that it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work, but at the same time, this is 6 years of work that is just being incrementally released. And so from my perspective, managing that is a lot more straightforward than it appears on the surface, because this is essentially me executing a plan that has been in development for 6 years. And so a lot of the actual, like, very hard work in learning and understanding and building, all of that has already been achieved. It's just a matter of releasing things out and testing things out and, like, making small adjustments and pivots and moving along. So from the perspective of launching a protocol, me doing this mostly solo, I cannot state how amazed I am at the open source community response that has happened, because there's definitely been people contributing now, and that's amazing. But I mean, like, in terms of Quilibrium Inc. and myself being the sole person there and getting this all rolled out, that's been very easy to manage. It's essentially just a long running roadmap that I am executing off of. In terms of how that relates to time management with Farcaster, my work for Farcaster is in a part-time style. So it's not 100% of my, normal working hours devoted to Farcaster, and then I just stack on another 100% for Quilibrium. There's a balance at play there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially since you've been working on it for over 6 years. I wonder, have there been any like huge changes to your roadmap, to your designs? Because it's 6 years, right? So have there like any big changes over time that you didn't expect to looking looking back? And do
Yeah,
you?
absolutely.
Yeah,
And that's been part of the design philosophy behind Q in the first place, was that you look at a lot of these networks like Ethereum, where there's strict design decisions, like, it uses SecP 256K1 for the elliptic curve. It uses a fixed width hash output and then truncated for addresses for accounts. These things are not versioned. So in other words, like, if they needed to use a different hashing scheme, like maybe SHA-3 was broken, or they needed to use a different, like a longer length address because the limited, entropy, the amount of bits that you're actually reducing your security to by decreasing the size of the address string is actually, like, dangerous for some reason. They kind of are stuck in these like boxes, because the design of Ethereum's architecture is not really meant to be versioned. It's in a way already kind of ossified. And so the way that Quilibrium is designed is that every single element of the protocol, whether it's the use of the VDF, or it's the signing algorithms that are supported for the various keys that are used on the network, or even the proving mechanism for providing data availability proofs, all of these things are hot swappable, in the sense that, like, a protocol update can immediately version pivot and the network will support it very easily. It's not something that would require, Leviathan engineering efforts, like when Ethereum for several years said they were going to switch to proof of stake from proof of work, but it ended up taking all the way until, what was it, 2021, 2022?
I think it was 2022. Yeah. But okay, so I mean, what I've seen on Farcaster, especially in the Equilibrium channel, and also, I mean, I watched the video you published on YouTube, and I recommend everybody you take a look at that video to watch it. It's in the show notes, so you can find the link where Casey explains 1 hour and a half equilibrium and a lot of the decisions. And so there are two things that I'm very, very interested in. The first one is you are not using a blockchain, right? You made that clear and you explained sort of the technical decisions. So I wonder if you can tell us kind of a summary of why Equilibrium is not really using blockchain, but you Equilibrium uses tokens, right? So it has a coin and there is collectibles as well. So, can you tell us a little bit about that, Casey? Why not using blockchain? You mentioned early when we started that blockchain outdated. So, can you tell us a bit about that decision and yeah, how this all works with tokens, coins in this network you're creating?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different things to consider. So the original Bitcoin white paper came out in 2008. And at the time, in terms of structures for data, like for consensus amongst disparate bundles of data, CRDTs hadn't actually hit the scene yet. Things like verifiable delay functions hadn't existed yet. These technologies were just new. And so whoever Satoshi was, in writing the Bitcoin white paper, was operating off of the technology and innovations that existed at the time. And so the idea of taking, these discrete transactions and entering them as a vector, or an array, if you will, and then putting it into a Merkle tree and using the Merkle tree as a way of basically checking proof of inclusion within a particular set, or in this case, a block, and then leveraging essentially the hash cache technique for generating, non-conflicting blocks. These are all things that happen by consequence of what was known at the time. And I think that because of Bitcoin being the first, and subsequently, there being some degree of research in the space around Byzantine fault tolerance, but a lot of it has basically been in the purview of how do we do BFT for blockchain and not like thinking outside the box. It's led to this kind of like almost cargo cult practice where people building new crypto networks, they don't even assume or think that there's alternative structures out there that can actually get them the same kind of consensus guarantees that they want about strict ordering of conflicting events such as double spins, so that double spins are eliminated. They don't think about that because this is a massively complicated, environment, and trying to solve all of those problems is definitely what becomes frequently known as a god project. Like you're trying to solve every single problem in one. And in some respects, Quilibrium has been that for me, is that it is actively trying to solve a whole bunch of different problems all at the same time. But the difference is I also have 6 years of being in those depths and doing that research and building out these new ideas. So the reason why we don't use blockchain is because blockchain is kind of outdated. So instead, what we do is it's actually a little bit of something new and something old. In the context of distributed databases, like just classical, centralized databases that might be sharded, but they are strictly controlled by a trusted party, there's a couple of different techniques for creating a distributed database where you would shard the data out such that you don't have all of the data on a singular logical database. Lots of different approaches to doing that, and you'll find that sometimes the architecture of the database itself begets the actual like way in which shards are created. So for example, wide column databases, you'll have a very explicit partition key that is created, or things like DynamoDB, where the hash basis essentially buckets into the shards of the database. These are all common structures now that have been well vetted for decades and decades. And the neat thing is that you can actually have that same kind of idea applied into decentralized data stores. We saw that as early as BitTorrent with the distributed hash table technique. And so That's kind of like one of the core pieces about distributing data out. But there's lots of blockchain-based networks that are also trying to do sharding, and so it's not something that's unique. The thing that makes it unique is how that sharding is achieved. And ultimately, that's the thing that we actually care about strict global consensus on, is just ensuring that each shard can maintain itself with appropriate proofs. But getting those proofs coordinated across the entire network is what has to actually have strict global consensus. And so the idea was that instead of having a, proof of work function or a proof of stake function, because either on one hand you are burning the earth or on the other you are just letting the rich get richer. Instead, what if you just had the network explicitly enforce that strict global consensus on those proofs? Because without it, the network would not function, and then bring the incentives down to the shard level. And so that was essentially the key inflection, was inverting that behavior so that proof of meaningful work became what it is today. And so the ordering of the network is actually dictated by essentially what is a cryptographic Lampert clock. Lampert clocks are used in distributed databases for a very long time to basically indicate deterministic ordering and sequencing of events on a causal relationship. And so we do the same thing, but we do it with verifiable delay functions. And so that's basically it. Use verifiable delay functions, use cryptographically unforgeable proofs that dictate where things will land on a given shard, and then use a strong unforgeable proof system for verifying that the data has not been altered in a way that would be conflicting based on two independent state changes. And that's basically the distinctions that made blockchain relevant.
And it sounds very very exciting. We'll add all these concepts, right, so people can easily find them if they want to read a little bit more. But that's quite interesting, Casey. And so, what's the name of the coin? Is it Quill? Am I right? That's the name of the coin from Quilibrium.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because like I didn't actually originally name it. I just was basically calling it Quilibrium's token. And I didn't put a name on it, but the community kind of did ahead of me. And so people were starting to call it Quill. And I was just like, okay, that works.
I know people can already run a node, right? There is a guide to do this. So I have two questions regarding this. So first, what kind of hardware do I need? Let's say I want to try it out, or Aleks wants to try it out. Do we need specific hardware that's powerful, or I can just take my MacBook Pro and run a node on Quilibrium? And also, my second question is, how does it work to exchange a coin with Quilibrium? So if I have some quills, how can I exchange them to other coins? So does it work like Uniswap? Is it connected to Ethereum in a way, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different questions there that the answer is actually kind of almost unified. There's a current state of things before we're fully launched as part of mainnet. I recently published a document that detailed the roadmap for how we're getting through this next phase of the network launch that brings us into a full mainnet. So right now we're still carving through any issues in getting nodes synced up. One of the things that I've noticed is that because there is an incentive associated with participating even in this phase of the network, there's been a very, very large number of people, whether they know they're doing this or not, I'm not sure, that are basically running underpowered nodes, and it's causing some issues. So we're trying to make sure that we can navigate through that and get past that synchronization issue, because that's just one of the it's not a condition of the final network that it would be so congested like this, but we want to make sure that we can appropriately handle it so that it doesn't become a type of an attack that somebody could use against the network. So right now we're still in that phase. We're about to move towards the mainnet, like full mainnet, where tokens unlock. So if you wanted to run a node right now, we do have a like baseline hardware requirement that's a bit higher power, but it's not like super aggressive. Like for example, a MacBook can run this just fine. It's just that the people that are spinning up like these one vCPU instances on a given VPS with like no real amount of bandwidth and all that, that particular crowd is the big problem at the moment, causing a lot of thrash on the network. But if you're running like a reasonably powerful workstation, even in this phase, you can participate just fine. The post mainnet phase, though, hardware requirements actually do drop down significantly. A Raspberry Pi 4 is actually our reference hardware for that phase of the network. So it's much lower power requirements, lower bandwidth requirements. Basically, it's a approach that scales in reward against what hardware you're providing and what resources you're providing. From the perspective of the token is just an application on the network. It's obviously the core incentive unit, so people care a lot about that. But at the end of the day, it's just an application on the network. So in our mainnet phase, the application is launched and accessible, and exchanging tokens, sending it to somebody, receiving them, etc. These are all just interactions, not entirely unlike what people see with Ethereum, with ERC20s, or on other networks very similarly. But in this case, the function call is a bit different. The RPC call is a bit different. Like we're a different network, so there's some differences. But we're uploading examples to our labs and the upcoming Q console to help builders understand how to integrate with that.
May I ask, so I guess it's still unclear when the mainnet launch is happening. I was listening to also your videos. You mentioned that there's copy code plagiarism happening out there. How big is this of an issue?
So yeah, that's definitely an issue inside the crypto scene. Like there's been entire projects that have been lifted wholesale and just rebranded, and they do like a twist that has like some sort of, like, for example, if it's a fair launch project, somebody comes along and steals the code base, creates their own version, does a non-fair launch, like a token reserve for the founders and stuff, and they're able to raise like very massive capital with certain VCs that are willing to look the other way about that, flagrant plagiarism. So for Q, the way that we've been trying to mediate that problem is to make sure that the fair launch is going to proceed as planned until the network is fully ready to launch for mainnet, and then tokens unlock, the contracts are deployed, all of that becomes public at that point. So that way we can avoid the sly capture that sometimes happens in this industry. So that being said, in that call I assume you're referencing, the roadmap was starting from February 29th. We begin the launch phase of mainnet, which is dusk. And we are already in that. The 1.4 release included a couple of different aspects about pure manifests, which is how we're able to support our auto scaling techniques for the network. And then the subsequent release of 1.5 is when the tokens themselves unlock, and that's currently slated for 10 days from now.
It's
oh my god, we can celebrate with this recording in 10 days. That's crazy.
I think we are getting close to the hour. Aleks, not sure if you have any additional questions. Casey, anything else you would like to add? Or anything important that maybe we didn't discuss for people that are
maybe some recommendations, yeah, or like things to look at. Obviously the market is heating up right now, and there'll be a lot of new people coming into the space. Maybe a word of advice for newcomers.
I think the biggest thing that I would like to call out is that, in the crypto space, there's lots of scams, rug pulls, etc. And it's a very frustrating thing. And it's frankly one of the things that makes it very, as a founder in the space trying to do something legitimate, it's a very infuriating thing to see. But on top of it, I just want to call it out in particular because even my own project has been getting flooded with people trying to grift on top of it, in the sense of like, I've had people creating fake, like, impersonation accounts of myself, people creating clones of that NFT that I had launched. I'm sure there's, websites that have like lifted the logos and design and everything, and they're wanting people to connect their Ethereum wallet, and it's a wallet drainer or anything like that. So the one big thing that I really want to call out is to, I mean, no matter what, always engage with skepticism, always be very cautious, and, be very careful about who is saying something to you and if they really are who they say they are.
Yeah, that makes absolutely sense, and probably will get worse, right? As time passes, the market heats up. But yeah, great advice, Casey, and thanks so much for your time. I think I learned a lot. I'm sure people will appreciate you sharing all your learnings and your journey. And yeah, looking forward for the big launch. I'll pay attention. I'll try to set up my own node to see how I do. I read it can take around 1 hour and a half or something like that. So I'll try to do that over the weekend. See how it goes.
Yeah, in the long term, I'm going to make running nodes a lot easier. Just as simple as running any other application. But the growing pains of a new network.
Mhm. Yeah, but it's exciting to be part of a new network. I think that's exciting. I want to try it out.
Yeah, there are many things we discussed, and I love that you sort of carry forwards the ethos of Web 1 in our present times. I think it's a lot, and leaving the conversation very inspired. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having me.